Right, everybody. Welcome back to what is known as the 5G Into the Abyss reading series. It's true that there's been about 5 or 6 days where I have not been reading. That's just a little bit of a time constraint and a few things finishing up in my life that I had to do, and 4 p.m. became complicated. So today I'm back. I'm excited to be back, and I hope to be as regular as I planned every day except Mondays, but you never know. It's almost every day, as the great critic Brian has been saying. If you haven't been following Brian Morgan, he's a leading critic on the 5G Into the Abyss reading series, and I highly recommend Googling him and finding no hits for it, but it's out there. A lovely man. Okay, so today I continue opening the door on my virtual balcony and standing outside and speaking to the virtual audience, very real texts that inspire me to reflect during these times of pause and quiet quarantine-tude, feeling a little bit between the monastery and the edge of a very high cliff. And we stare into the abyss that happens to always be around us. It's just sometimes we don't notice it because comfort and certainty become the veil that we hide behind. So today, I continue with a fantastic essay by, this is a very bold choice of mine, but I'm going to do it anyway, by David Foster Wallace. David Foster Wallace obviously has so much that he's written and obviously stared into the abyss for amounts of time that maybe none of us could handle. And it's great because he's a relatively contemporary writer, and this essay that I am going to read is a piece from his famous novel, Infinite Jest. This is a piece from Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, and my copy has tape all over it, so it's hard for me to even figure out the publisher, but I will tell you it is published by Back Bay Books, a Little Brown and Company publishing house. So I pick up in the chapter entitled, Why, though in the early days of Interlace's interneted teleputers that operated off largely the same fiber digital grid as the phone companies, the advent of video telephoning, aka VIDEOPHONY, enjoyed an interval of huge consumer popularity. Callers thrilled at the idea of phone interfacing both orally and facially, the little first-generation phone video cameras being too crude and narrow-apertured for anything much more than facial close-ups, on first-generation teleputers that, at that time, were little more than high-tech TV sets, though of course they had that little intelligent agent homuncular icon that would appear at the lower right of a broadcast cable program and tell you the time and temperature outside, or remind you to take your blood pressure medication, or alert you to a particularly compelling entertainment option now coming up on channel like 491 or something, or of course now alerting you to an incoming video phone call, and then tap dancing with a little iconic straw boater and cane just under a menu of possible options for response. And callers did love their little homuncular icons. But why, within like 16 months or 5 sales quarters, the tumescent demand curve for VIDEOPHONY suddenly collapsed like a kicked tent, so that by the year of the Depend adult undergarment, fewer than 10% of all private telephone communications utilized any video image fiber data transfers or coincident products and services, the average US phone user deciding that he actually preferred the retrograde old tech Bell era voice-only telephonic interface, after all, a preferential about face that cost a good many precipitant video telephony-related entrepreneurs their shirts plus destabilizing two highly respected mutual funds that had ground floored heavily in videophone technology and very nearly wiping out Maryland State Employees Retirement System's Freddie Mac Fund, a fund whose administrator's mistress's brother had been an almost maniacally precipitant videophone technology entrepreneur. But, so why the abrupt consumer retreat back to good old voice-only telephoning? That's the title of the chapter. The answer, in a kind of trivial nutshell, is 1, emotional stress, 2, physical vanity, 3, a certain queer kind of self-obliterating logic in the microeconomics of consumer high-tech. So 1, it turned out that there was something terribly stressful about visual telephone interfaces that hadn't been stressful at all about voice-only interfaces. Videophone consumers seemed suddenly to realize that they'd been subject to an insidious but wholly marvelous delusion about conventional voice-only telephony. They never noticed it before, the delusion. It's like it was so emotionally complex that it could be countenanced only in the context of its loss. Good old traditional audio-only phone conversations allowed you to presume that the person on the other end was paying complete attention to you while also permitting you not to have to pay anything even close to complete attention to her. A traditional oral-only conversation utilizing a handheld phone whose earpiece contained only 6 little pinholes, but whose mouthpiece, rather significantly, it later seemed, contained 6 squared or 36 little pinholes, let you enter a kind of highway hypnotic, semi-attentive fugue. While conversing, you could look around the room, doodle, find groom, peel off tiny bits of dead skin away from your cuticles, compose phone pad haiku, stir things on the stove. You could even carry on a whole separate additional sign language and exaggerated facial expression type of conversation with people right there in the room with you, all while seeming to be right there attending closely to the voice on the phone. And yet, this was the retrospectively marvelous part. Even as you were dividing your attention between the phone call and all sorts of other idle little fugue-like activities, you were somehow never haunted by the suspicion that the person on the other end's attention might be similarly divided. During a traditional call, for example, as you, let's say, performed a close tactile blemish scan of your chin, you were in no way oppressed by the thought that your phone mate was perhaps also devoting a good percentage of her attention on a close tactile blemish scan. It was an illusion, and the illusion was oral and orally supported. The phone line's other end's voice was dense, tightly compressed, and vectored right into your ear, enabling you to imagine that the voice's owner's attention was similarly compressed and focused. Even though your own attention was not, was the thing. This bilateral illusion of unilateral attention was almost infinitely gratifying from an emotional standpoint. You got to believe you were receiving somebody's complete attention without having to return it. Regarded with the objectivity of hindsight, the illusion appears irrational, almost literally fantastic. It would be like being able to both lie and to trust other people at the same time. Video telephony rendered the fantasy insupportable. Callers now found they had to compose the same sort of earnest, slightly over-intense listener's expression they had to compose for in-person exchanges. Those callers who out of unconscious habit succumbed to fugue-like doodling or pants-creasing adjustment now came off looking rude, absent-minded, or childishly self-absorbed. Callers who even more unconsciously blemish-scanned or nostril-explored looked up to find horrified expressions on the video faces on the other end, all of which resulted in videophonic stress. Mind you, this was written between 1994 and 1996. Even worse, of course, was the traumatic expulsion from Eden feeling of looking up from tracing your thumb's outline on the reminder pad or adjusting the old unit's angle of repose in your shorts and actually seeing your videophonic interfacee idly strip a shoelace of its gumlet as she talked to you, and suddenly realizing your whole infantile fantasy of commanding your partner's attention while you yourself got to fugue, doodle, and make little genital adjustments was diluted and insupportable, and that you were actually commanding not one bit more attention than you were paying here. The whole attention business was monstrously stressful, video callers found. And the video, number 2, And the videophonic stress was even worse if you were at all vain. For example, if you worried at all about how you looked, as in to other people, which, all kidding aside, who doesn't? Good old oral telephone calls could be fielded without makeup, toupee, surgical prostheses, etc., even without clothes, if that sort of thing rattled your saber. But for the image conscious, there was of course no such answer as you are informality about visual video telephone calls, which consumers began to see were less like having the good old phone ring than having the doorbell ring and having to throw on clothes and attach prostheses and do hair checks in the foyer mirror before answering the door. But the real coffin nail for videophony involved the way callers' faces looked on their TP screen during calls. Not their callers' faces, but their own when they saw them on video. It was a 3-button affair, after all, to use the TP's cartridge card's video record option, video record option, to record both pulses in a 2-way visual call and play the call back and see how your face had actually looked to the other person during the call. This sort of appearance check was no more resistible than a mirror. But the experience proved almost universally horrifying. People were horrified at how their own faces appeared on a TP scan. It wasn't just Anchorman's bloat, that well-known impression of extra weight that video inflicts on the face. It was worse. Even with high-end TP's high-def viewer screens, consumers perceived something essentially blurred and moist-looking about their phone faces, a shiny, pallid indefiniteness that struck them as not just unflattering, but somehow evasive, furtive, untrustworthy, unlikable. In an early and ominous interlaced GTE focus group survey that was all but ignored in a storm of entrepreneurial sci-fi tech enthusiasm, almost 60% of respondents who received visual access to their own faces during videophonic calls specifically used the terms untrustworthy, unlikable, or hard to like in describing their own visage's appearance, with a phenomenally ominous 71% of senior citizen respondents specifically comparing their video faces to that of Richard Nixon during the Nixon-Kennedy debates of BS 1960. The proposed solution to what the telecommunications industry's psychological consultants termed video physiognomic dysphoria, or VPD, was, of course, the advent of high-definition masking. And in fact, it was those entrepreneurs who gravitated toward the production of high-definition videophonic imaging and then outright masks who got in and out of the short-lived videophonic era with their shirts plus solid additional nets. Mask-wise, the initial option of high-definition photographic imaging, i.e. taking the most flattering elements of a variety of flattering multi-angle photos of a given phone consumer and, thanks to existing image configuration equipment already pioneered by the cosmetics and law enforcement industries, combining them into a wildly attractive high-def broadcastable composite of a face wearing an earnest, slightly over-intense expression of complete attention, was quickly supplanted by the more inexpensive and bite-economical option of using the exact same cosmetic and FBI software, actually casting the enhanced facial image in a form-fitting polybutylene resin mask. And consumers soon found that the high upfront cost of a permanent wearable mask was more than worth it, considering the stress and VPD reduction benefits and the convenient Velcro straps for the back of the mask and the collar's head cost peanuts. And for a couple fiscal quarters, phone cable companies were able to rally VPD-afflicted consumers' confidence by working out a horizontally integrated deal where free composite and masking services came with a video phone hookup. The high-def masks, when not in use, simply hung on a small hook on the side of a TP's phone console, admittedly looking maybe a bit surreal and discomfiting when detached and hanging there empty and wrinkled, and sometimes there were potentially awkward mistaken identity snafus involving multi-user family or company phones and the hurried selection and attachment of the wrong mask taken from some long row of empty hanging masks. But all in all, the masks seem initially like a viable industry response to the vanity, stress, and Nixonian facial image problem. 2, and maybe also 3, but combine the natural entrepreneurial instinct to satisfy all sufficiently high consumer demand on the one hand with what appears to be an almost equally natural distortion in the way persons tend to see themselves, and it becomes possible to account historically for the speed with which the whole high-def videophonic mass thing spiraled totally out of control. Not only is it weirdly hard to evaluate what you yourself look like, whether, like you're good looking or not. For example, try looking in the mirror and determining where you stand in the attractiveness hierarchy with anything like the objective ease. You can determine whether just about anyone else you know is good looking or not. But it turned out that consumers instinctively skewed self-perception. Plus, vanity-related stress meant that they began preferring and then outright demanding videophone masks that were really quite a lot better looking than they themselves were in person. High-def mask entrepreneurs ready and willing to supply not just verisimilitude, but aesthetic enhancement, stronger chins, smaller eye bags, airbrushed scars and wrinkles, soon pushed the original mimetic mask entrepreneurs right out of the market. In a gradually unsubtilizing progression, with a couple more sales quarters, most consumers were now using masks so undeniably better looking on video phones than their real faces were in person, transmitting to one another such horrendously skewed and enhanced masked images of themselves that enormous psychosocial stress began to result. The large number of phone users suddenly reluctant to leave home and interface personally with people who they feared were now habituated to seeing their far better looking masked selves on the phone and would, on seeing them in person, suffer. So went the caller's phobia, the same illusion-shattering aesthetic disappointment that, for example, certain women who always wear makeup give people the first time they ever see them without makeup. The social anxieties surrounding the phenomenon, psych consultants termed optimistically misrepresentational masking, or OMM, intensified steadily as the tiny, crude first-generation videophone cameras technology improved to where the aperture wasn't as narrow. And now the higher-end tiny cameras could countenance and transmit more or less full-body images. Certain psychologically unscrupulous entrepreneurs began marketing full-body polybutylene and urethane 2D cutouts, sort of like the headless muscle man and bathing beauty cutouts you could stand behind and position your chin on in the cardboard neck stump for cheap photos at the beach. Only these full-body videophone masks were vastly more high-tech and convincing looking. Once you added the variable 2D wardrobe, hair, and eye color options, various aesthetic enlargements and reductions, etc., costs started to press the envelope of mass market affordability, even though there was, at the same time, horrific social pressure to be able to afford the very best possible masked 2D body image, to keep from feeling comparatively hideous looking on the phone. How long, then, could one expect it to have been before the relentless entrepreneurial drive toward an even better mousetrap conceived of the transmittable tableau, aka TT, which in retrospect was probably the really sharp business end of the videophonic coffin nail. With TTs, facial and bodily masking could now be dispensed with altogether and replaced with the video transmitted image of what essentially a heavily doctored still photograph. One of an incredibly fit and attractive and well turned out human being, someone who actually resembled you, the caller, only in such limited respects as like race and limb number, the photo's face focused attentively in the direction of the videophonic camera from amid the sumptuous but not ostentatious appointments of the sort of room that best reflected the image of yourself you wanted to transmit, etc. The tableau were simply high-quality transmission-ready photographs, scaled down to diorama-like proportions and fitted with a plastic holder over the videophone camera, not unlike a lens cap. Extremely good-looking but not terrifically successful entertainment celebrities, the same sort in decades past who would have swelled the cast lists of infomercials, found themselves in demand as models for various high-end videophone tableaux. Because they involved simple transmission-ready photography, instead of computer imaging and enhancement, the tableau could be mass-produced and commensurately priced. And for a brief time, they helped ease the tension between the high cost of enhanced body masking and the monstrous aesthetic pressures VIDEOPHONY exerted on callers, not to mention also providing employment for set designers, photographers, airbrushers, and infomercial-level celebrities hard-pressed by the declining fortunes of broadcast television advertising. Number 3. But there's some sort of revealing lesson here in the beyond short-term viability curve of advances in consumer technology. The career of videophony conforms neatly to this curve's classically annular shape. First, there's some sort of terrific sci-fi-like advance in consumer tech, like from oral to videophony, which advance always, however, has certain unforeseen disadvantages for the consumer. And then, oh, we have a guest. Let's go. First, there's some sort of terrific sci-fi-like advance in consumer tech, like from oral to videophony, which advance always, however, has certain unforeseen disadvantages for the consumer. And then, but the market niches created by those disadvantages, like people's stressfully vain repulsion at their own videophonic appearance, are ingeniously filled via sheer entrepreneurial verve. And yet the very advantages of these ingenious disadvantage compensations seem all too often to undercut the original high-tech advance, resulting in consumer recidivism and curve closure and massive shirt loss for precipitant investors. In the present case, the stress and vanity compensation's own evolution saw video callers rejecting first their own faces and then even their own heavily masked and enhanced physical likenesses, and finally covering the video cameras altogether and transmitting attractively stylized static tableau to one another's TPs. And behind these lens cap dioramas and transmitted tableau, callers of course found that they were once again stresslessly invisible, unvainly makeup and toupee-less and baggy-eyed behind their celebrity dioramas, once again to free, since once again unseen, to doodle, blemish scan, manicure, crease check, while on their screen, the attractive, intensely attentive face of the well-appointed celebrity on the other end's tableau reassured them that they were the objects of a concentrated attention they themselves didn't have to exert. And of course, but these advantages were nothing other than the once lost and now appreciated advantages of good old Bel Era blind, oral-only telephoning with its 6 and 6 squared pinholes. The only difference was that now these expensive, silly, unreal, stylized tableaux were being transmitted between TPs on high-priced video fiber lines. How much time after this realization sank in and spread among consumers, mostly via phone, interestingly, would any microeconometrist expect to need to pass before high-tech visual videophony was mostly abandoned, then a return to good old telephoning, not only dictated by common consumer sense, but actually, after a while, culturally approved as a kind of chic integrity, not Luddism, but a kind of retrograde transcendence of sci-fi-ish high-tech for its own sake, a transcendence of the vanity and the slavery to high-tech fashion that people view as so unattractive in one another. In other words, a return to oral-only telephony became, at the closed curve's end, a kind of status symbol of anti-vanity, such that only callers utterly lacking in self-awareness continue to use videophony and tableau. To say nothing of masks and these tacky facsimile-using people became ironic cultural symbols of tacky vain slavery to corporate PR and high-tech novelty, became the subsidized era's tacky equivalents of people with leisure suits, black velvet paintings, sweater vests for their poodles, electric zirconium jewelry, no-coat lingua scrapers, and most communications consumers put their tableau dioramas at the back of a knick-knack shelf and cover their cameras with standard black lens caps, and now use their phone consoles, little mask hooks, to hang these new little plasticine address and phone diaries specifically made with a little receptacle at the top of the binding for convenient hanging from former mask hooks. Even then, of course, the bulk of US consumers remain verifiably reluctant to leave home and teleputer and to interface personally, though this phenomenon's endurance can't be attributed to the videophony fad per se, and anyway, the new panagoraphobia served to open huge new entrepreneurial teleputerized markets for home shopping and delivery, and didn't cause much industry concern. There it is. I'm gonna stop there. That's the chapter on videophony from David Foster Wallace. David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. It's incredibly prescient considering it was written between 94 and 96. That sense of videophony certainly rings true today. So I may continue with a little more from Infinite Jest tomorrow. And other than that, thanks for tuning in. And I will see all my wonderful 5G friends later.